can tell us. While I have your attention, a few announcements on top of this. First, if you're not a member, bump a member to ask questions. Only questions come from the working media and members. If you'd like to be a member, and we'd like you to, please join. Membership dues are now being taken for 2024. Mr. Hightower is right there in the back. He's waving at us. You can do credit card, check, or eggs, I think, are still usable at this point. So definitely pay those. And then please, when you do ask your question, identify yourself, and we will go from there. Our next meeting after today will not be until January 22nd. So you have the whole Christmas holiday off, so no excuse for being naughty. Okay? All right. With that, Mr. John Couvillon, thank you.
Okay, we'll do the mic check first. Well, first off, thanks very much for being here today. This is actually the good time of year because now that the political election season is pretty much in the rearview mirror, other than a few races in St. Landry and Cameron parishes that are having to be rerun because of a tie, this is where we all get to talk about things in a philosophical mode as opposed to things that get said in the heat of the conflict. So I'm John Couvillon. I am a pollster, political analyst, troublemaker, et cetera, and I have been involved in elections, pretty much my whole life, but I have been doing polling since 2010. There's three things I wanted to talk about today as we talk about the 2023 elections in the rearview mirror, and I like to think of this in terms of themes because to me anybody can do punditry, but I think it's more important to look at the big picture because there's things going on in Louisiana politically that are a little bit more than just whether Jeff Landry won and by how much. There's really things that I think are affecting the underlying tectonic plates of Louisiana politics. So those themes accordingly, I'm going to talk about how the partisan winds are blowing. Theme number 2 is going to be the rise of the early voter. And theme number 3 is going to be the power of the party base. Now, the power of the party base, which is, of course, saving the best for last, that's the kind of thing that is guaranteed to give political consultants headaches because you do have some people who think that they could elect a candidate based on charm and TV appearance, when, in fact, the truth is understanding the state's underlying demographics is much more important and vital in terms of getting your candidate to the finish line because quite a few consultants, in my opinion, didn't pay attention to this basic fact, and they had candidates who ended up at 5%, regardless of how many commas were in the monies that were spent on campaigning. So the first thing I want to talk about is how the partisan winds are blowing. One of the things that's important to appreciate is really how much Louisiana has transformed really in the last 15 years. But if we go back for a generation, you'll remember how the norm here in Louisiana was that we were a populist democratic state that adhered to the politics of Edwin Edwards and his adherents. That has pretty much changed, and you don't really have that political alignment anymore, although I will say populism did not die in Louisiana. It just got reborn on the Republican side. So in other words, the old days of the stereotypical Republican being in Mandeville and Metairie, that has now been replaced with the Republican epicenter being Mansoura and Marksville. And, well, I'll throw in Mamou too. Understanding that, because we are still a fairly rural state, to me is key to understanding Louisiana politics. So when I'm talking about the political winds, that's really what I'm referring to is the fact that Louisiana has pretty much up and down the ballot transformed into a Republican-friendly state. Now you'll notice that I'm using nuances here and saying Republican-friendly as opposed to Republicans being in control forevermore, because there is the small technical matter of the fact that there are more registered Democrats than Republicans. Now, a lot of that, in my opinion, is due to inertia, but the fact that you have more Democrats than Republicans, it's not like we're irrevocably Republican forever, but if you are a Republican in this state, it's much easier to win elections nowadays, and the 2023 elections pretty much prove that. More specifically, I'd like to talk about the numbers, because anybody can do spin and say we're a Republican state. I want to put some numbers behind that spin. So one of the things I like to do anytime I give a presentation, the first thing I start off with is voter registration data, because voter registration data over time is going to approximate what people's partisan preferences are. Now, given that you have people who probably first registered to vote in 1975 and going down to the registrar of voters to change your party affiliation is not exactly on anybody's to-do list, you do have legacy Democratic voters who still exist. So really what's more important to me over time is the trend as opposed to the numbers per se. So what I think is a good before and after time period to use, given that we're nearing the end of the Edwards administration, when Governor Edwards was first inaugurated, the party registration breakdown, and this is January 2016, you had just over 1.3 million Democrats, approximately 820,000 Republicans, and about 750,000 independents. And by the way, this is one of those things people get into nitpicking exercises with me over on Twitter. My definition of independent is basically a catch-all, because technically you have unaffiliated, you have independent, you have reform, constitution, et cetera, et cetera. I just throw them all under the umbrella of independent, because in the old days, you truly did have that as the non-Republican and non-Democratic option, or really the only non-Democratic and non-Republican option. So that's what the numbers looked like in January 2016. The December 2023 figures show a clear trend towards the Republicans. More specifically, we have 1.15 million registered Democrats, or a loss in absolute term of 184,000 voters. And one of the things I see when I look at the party numbers every month, because the Secretary of State is kind enough to post them on the 1st, in absolute numbers, I see the Democratic number continually declining every month, and it is within the realm of possibility, in my opinion, in 3 to 5 years, for there to be more Republicans numerically than Democrats. But having said that, 1.15 million Democrats, Republicans are just over 1 million, independents are approximately 820,000. So in the time that John Bel Edwards has been governor, we have 64,000 more independents, 187,000 more Republicans, 184,000 less Democrats. And the dynamic I typically see in presidential years, which of course will be coming shortly, is that Republicans typically out-register independents and Democrats, because one of the things that does bring people to Team Red, so to speak, is that because in the one instance of presidential preference primaries, we have closed primaries, that does mean if you want to choose Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis or Nikki Haley or et cetera, you have to be a registered Republican, as opposed to just thinking you could waltz in like you would on a typical open primary election. So the party registration numbers to me are most important, just from understanding of where things are going. And in fact, if you were to look at a color map, which I do occasionally post on social media, by and large, the rural parishes with moderate to low black populations and the suburban parishes, you either have Republican pluralities or majorities nowadays. The parishes that have strong Democratic voter edge, of course, are generally Democratic voting parishes. I mean, two perfect examples would be Orleans and East Baton Rouge and Caddo. But you can start to see now that there is a clear divide of which parishes have Republican versus Democratic voter registration majorities. So that's the first thing to me that is the most salient point of how things have changed in Louisiana over time, is to look at the party registration figures. The second thing I like to talk about is, if you were to look at the October and the November primary elections, one of the things I like to do is I look beyond the personalities, i.e. the candidates running, and I take an aggregate of what the Democratic and the Republican vote is for each of these statewide races. One of the things that most caught my attention when looking both at October and November is this. Number one, the party numbers between October and November did not appreciably change. In other words, what the Democratic vote was in October is pretty much what the three statewide candidates got in November. The other thing which is important when we're talking about what happened in October and November is the percentage of the vote that went to Democratic candidates. It was shockingly low. I mean, the best performing Democratic candidate in October, ironically, was Dustin Granger for treasurer. He got 32% of the vote and 35% of the runoff vote. That was the best performance of any Democrat in any statewide office, because once you get outside of Dustin Granger, the Attorney General, they had two Democratic candidates who in the aggregate got 31% in the primary, 34% in the runoff. The Secretary of State Democratic candidates, 30 and 33. Sean Wilson plus another Democrat, 29%. Lieutenant Governor, 20%. In other words, what you're talking about is a shockingly low Democratic voter base. And by the way, the dirty little secret is it wasn't much better in the 2019 primary. The difference was, of course, John Bel Edwards substantially overperformed generic Democrats. Between him and Omar Dantzler, they got 47% of the primary vote. But once you got outside of the 2019 gubernatorial primary, the Democratic candidates got between 32 and 35%. So in other words, whether you're talking about this year when people were paying attention or in 2019, there was not evidence of this strong Democratic voter base. And so that's something that any Democrat running for statewide or local office in the future has to be cognizant of, is there just simply isn't the voter base there that there might have been a generation ago when you would see the Democratic vote typically in the 50s. The other thing that's important when we're talking about the partisan wins, besides the partisan racial turnout, the other thing which has to be discussed is the racial composition of those who voted. And you'll notice I said the word voted and not voter registration, because one of the things I've seen over time, and I've been following this all the way back to 1983, black voter turnout is a variable thing. In other words, sometimes it is turbocharged and sometimes it is not. The 2023 elections were an example of the not, although ironically the 2019 runoff was an example of really the highest black voter turnout I had ever seen in the 3 decades I've been following it. So more specifically, in 2019 in the runoff, when Governor Edwards invested heavily in a turnout infrastructure, so we have a 31% black electorate if we look at voter registration. It rarely hits 31% in elections, but in the one instance of John Bel Edwards' runoff victory, where he beat Eddie Rispone by about 40,000 votes, it was a 31% black electorate, which was the highest I had seen in data I had transcribed going all the way back to 1996. The lowest, incidentally, would have been in 2023. In fact, when I looked all the way back to 1996, only 3 times has the black percentage of the electorate been at or below 25%. The first was the 2007 primary, the one where Bobby Jindal won without a runoff. The second would be the 2 elections we had this year. More specifically, the primary had a 25% black electorate and the runoff had a 24% black electorate, which is pretty low when you consider that they are 31% of the registered voters. And that is important. It used to be that the Democrats ran by the 30-30 rule, which is you want a black electorate of 30%, and then you can get 30% of the white vote to get you over the top. This is a strategy that, of course, was successfully employed by John Breaux, by Kathleen Blanco, by Mary Landrieu, et cetera, et cetera. But you'll notice that even in those victories, those were not overwhelmingly Democratic victories. Those were more like 52, 53%. Well, what has happened since then is that the second part of the 30, which is getting 30% of the white vote, that leg has been knocked out, and very rarely do the Democrats even come close to attaining that. Now you're talking about they're getting 15 to 20% of the white vote, which of course higher percentages here in Orleans and East Baton Rouge. But what that means in plain terms is if you don't have the votes that you can get out of, say, an Avoyelles Parish or an Allen Parish, or let's go up north to be geographically balanced here and say a Wynn Parish, if you can't get an appreciable share of the vote in those parishes like what John Bel Edwards did in 15 and 19, quite simply stated, you do not have a chance to win. But part of that is the first leg, which, as I mentioned before, is you want a black electorate of about 30%. And when you're coming in at 25 and 24% like you did this year, that's nowhere near what the Democrats need to be able to win on a statewide basis. So that's the first thing that I wanted to talk about, is basically the direction of the partisan wins, but using numbers instead of just mere spin. Because understanding numbers to me is important when you're looking at which way the state is going. And I could have pretty much told people that after I saw the Democratic numbers, about 30% in each of those statewide races in the primary, it wasn't going to magically jump to 51% in the runoff. I mean, yeah, you would have a few disgruntled supporters of one of the Republican candidates who didn't make the runoff, but that in itself is not enough to make it to 51%. So that's theme number one, is just the changing partisan winds. The second theme, which is one I love to expound about endlessly, and I have followed it all the way back to 2007, I want to say the genesis of the early vote, and some of the veterans on here can correct me if I'm way out of line. I want to say that in the aftermath of Katrina, former Representative Waddell had passed a bill that allowed for in-person early voting. And at the time, it took a while to catch on in Louisiana because we are adherents of tradition. And typically, if you'll remember the old days when you pretty much had to have a valid excuse, whether it be an LSU game or out of state, or you were ill, or you were working out of state, just to be able to vote before Election Day. And commonly, you would have about a 3% early vote. Along came early voting in 2006, and really, to me, it didn't get revved up until the 2007 statewide elections, when you had the grand total of 11% of the electorate was casting ballots before Election Day. Early voting is one of those kinds of things, though, that once you start doing it, you start realizing, hey, this is so much more convenient than waiting until Election Day to cast your ballot and being potentially stuck in line. So that 11% number has steadily risen to the point where in the pandemic year of 2020, when we added on extra early voting days and we loosened up the mail-in voting rules, we had a record high of 46% of the vote being cast early. And we came very close to hitting 1 million. And in my opinion, had we not had the hurricane, which spiraled through Orleans and Jefferson parishes in the last week of the 2020 election, I'm of the opinion we would have had 1 million early voters. Now, that is important from the standpoint of if you're one of those who still believes in the old, in my opinion, outdated tradition of basically backloading all your election expenses to the night before election or the week before election, you're pretty much missing the boat because the vote's already spoken for. This year, we were on the higher end in terms of early voting participation. And by the way, for definitional sake, when I use the word early voting, I'm basically conflating in-person and mail. And as I will talk about shortly, mail has its role to play as well. This year, we were on the higher end with early voting, the second and fourth highest ever, by the way. 34% of the total early vote was cast early in the primary, and that number went to 41% in the runoff. So imagine if you're one of these political candidates where you think you're being smart by holding onto your money at the last minute. Well, that is, in my opinion, very unwise for two reasons. Number one, 34 and 41% don't care what you think. And number two, you're taking a chance in thinking that the remaining 59 and 66% are even going to be influenced so easily by last-minute attacks or whatnot. In other words, you really have to tailor your campaign, in my opinion, towards the more formative period of when voters are making up their minds, which I like to use the John Couvillon rule of thumb is 2 to 6 weeks out is when you really should do the bulk of your campaign communications. The other thing about early voting, which I like to expound upon endlessly in social media and other forums, is you have to think of early voting in terms of 3 election days. So you have your traditional election day, where there are people who they do love interacting with their commissioners and they can't imagine anything but voting on election day. That is a significant, albeit diminishing constituency. You have the 1 week of early voting. I think of that as the other early voting day. And what's interesting about people's behavior with that early voting is you basically have a bimodal distribution. More specifically, people who I like to call the jackrabbits you have a lot of people like to vote on that first day, whether it be Saturday or Tuesday. Then you have the procrastinators who like to wait until the second Saturday or the second Tuesday. And then during the weekday, you have a kind of a slump. So that's the second election day. But the third election day, which has taken on an enhanced role ever since the pandemic started, and you can make an argument that ever since about, let's see, I think it was 2016, 2017, when the Secretary of State started automatically mailing out ballots to those who are 65 or above, you do have a constituency of people who, the moment they get that ballot 4 to 6 weeks out from Election Day, they're going to vote it right then and there. So the thing I always try to warn candidates is, what kind of information does does a voter have at his or her disposal when that ballot hits? In other words, you really need to be prepared to make sure that everybody knows everybody as much as possible about your campaign when those ballots hit, because you don't know the assumptions a voter is using when he or she is turning that ballot in on the kitchen table after 4 weeks out. The reason I'm bringing up mail-in voting, historically it was a footnote where it was for the longest time about 3% of the electorate. Then along came a combination of, number one, the permanent absentee list, and number two, the pandemic. The thing about the pandemic that, in my opinion, changed voting behavior is kind of a variation of the old saying about if you build it, they will come. So even though Louisianians are adherents to tradition, which is voting on Election Day, if you start introducing alternate modes of voting and they experiment with those alternate modes, such as concerns over going to a polling place and possibly being infected, and then you realize, wow, this is very convenient, well, all of a sudden you have a behavioral change. That, in fact, has been the case in elections from the summer of 2020 on, when you'll remember that we had to delay our presidential election for primary for 4 months because we were in the midst of the pandemic. But more specifically, when I'm talking about the influence of mail-in voting, 3% pretty consistently voted by mail before the pandemic. That number has steadily risen. In the 2023 election, 9% in the primary and 13% in the runoff of the total vote was cast by mail-in ballots. So when you're talking about when voters are paying attention, to me, the beginning really is when those mail ballots hit the table. And by the way, what can be challenging for campaigns, each parish has its own idea about when to send out the mail-in ballots. It's really at the discretion of the registrar. But regardless of when the registrar wants to send the ballots out, the point is that is a third election day that you have to be cognizant of. And given that we had 9 and 13% of the vote being cast that way in the 2023 elections, I would expect to see a similar volume from a percentage standpoint in the presidential election next year. So what that means in plain terms is if you're talking about, typically about 2 million Louisianians like to vote in the presidential election. If you're having approximately 150 to 200,000 votes being cast starting when the ballots drop in probably early October, that's a variable that has to be accounted for if you want to have a credible campaign, as opposed to thinking you could just wait until that last week and do all your communications then. So that to me is another thing that is worth talking about when you're talking about how things have changed in Louisiana. And that's before I've even breathed a word about Jeff Landry or Sean Wilson, is understanding that, number one, we have had a top to bottom realignment that favors Republicans because we are a largely rural state. And number two, understanding that Louisiana is joining the rest of the nation in embracing early voting of different types. Now, we're not quite there in terms of like a Georgia or North Carolina where 50 to 70% of the vote is cast early, but I do believe that the number is steadily going to keep rising, which basically redistributes when you have to think of campaign communications. So that's something I think that is worth talking about, is the rise of in-person and mail-in voting, that the two of them comprise two of the three legs of the three-legged stool that is otherwise known as Election Day. The third part of what I think is worth talking about, and this is the most fun part because now we get to talk about personalities, would be the governor race. And when I'm looking at the governor's race, the thing that I think is important to understand, I'm using the term base power. What I'm getting at is this idea that you could run commercials and you could magically peel off 30% of the vote without an organized or well thought of strategic plan. Well, that's a very outdated notion. Because basically what you have in the era of polarization, I would say it started in the Clinton years, about early 90s. You have approximately, depending on turnout intensity, 25 to 30% of the vote is the black vote, and they skew pretty strongly Democratic, although I am noticing erosions in recent elections, not just with the John Kennedy race, but with the Jeff Landry race and with the runoffs. You, of course, have 35 to 40% of the vote being cast by Republicans. And by the way, my definition of Republicans are the registered ones. as opposed to people who in a poll say I'm a Republican, because we are one of the states fortunate enough to register voters by party, which certainly makes it easier if you're doing targeting. But we're talking about base strategy and really why does it matter in terms of the governor's race. Quite simply what happened was this, and this is where we get into the kind of parallel notion that I like to talk about, which is the swim lanes, which is appreciating that you do have different types of voters who respond to different political stimuli, as it were, and that affects how they vote. So to use the simplest term, the things that may interest a voter in South Baton Rouge, in Metairie, in the affluent parts of Lafayette, in St. Tammany Parish, et cetera, it's entirely different than what would attract a voter who lives in, say, Acadiana or in blue-collar neighborhoods and so forth. And so you have to appreciate the attitudes of these different voter blocks if you want to assemble enough of them to make a runoff. Now, one of the things that I think is important to talk about when we want to assess how Jeff Landry got to become governor on the first primary, a decision he made, or excuse me, a decision which was made to pursue the Republican endorsement early, more specifically a year before Election Day. Now, I will admit at the time, I did not think that was a strategically wise decision. However, as time went on and none of the other Republicans took off, I started to appreciate the logic of it, because not only did it provide another fundraising vehicle, but it also basically sent a signal to voters who were either conservative and or Republican that, you know, hey, Jeff Landry is the endorsed Republican candidate. Using those words, I do find brings voters to your side, and so we're talking about a 35 to 40% Republican bloc. And by the way, that number was higher this year because Republicans outvoted Democrats both in the primary and the runoff, which, by the way, it was only the third time in Louisiana history I could ever think of that happening. The third time, by the way, was John Kennedy's reelection in November 2022. But when we're talking about getting the Republican base, Jeff Landry, in my opinion, clinched that vote early on, and I saw it happening in my polling where he pretty much polled solidly at 30% for months while voters were not really paying attention. But as time went on and the other candidates failed to take off, that 30% slowly and steadily and surely rose to a point to where people were actually talking about whether he could win without a runoff several weeks before the primary. In my opinion, the reason that happened was, and for those of you fortunate enough to have the handouts, when I'm talking about the swim lanes, when Sean Wilson received and I'm going to go top to bottom here, when Sean Wilson received Governor Edwards' imprimatur that basically, in my opinion, was a broad hint that no other Democrats need apply, that pretty much locked down about 30% of the vote because no Democrat was going to go against an incumbent Democratic governor. So Sean Wilson, to me, had a pretty solid lock on one of the runoff spots. The question mark then became who would be the other runoff contender. Because Jeff Landry pretty much had an unshakable hold on what I call the Republican swim lane, which is every poll I did going all the way back to the spring, I saw he had solid support in Acadiana and in North Louisiana alike. And in some of these Acadiana parishes, I'm talking about in the 50s and 60s, even back in the spring. So when you have that voter base and that gives you time to start picking off other voters, such as in Jefferson and St. Tammany and so forth, well, you could appreciate from a mathematical standpoint, it's not hard to become the dominant player on the conservative swim lane. The only thing that could have changed that dynamic, in my opinion, that did not happen, when we talk about the Republican swim lane, one of the common misnomers is that all Republicans think alike. A lot depends on where you're from. So I had thought that perhaps if we're talking about, say, suburban and or affluent neighborhoods, that one of the quote-unquote more moderate Republican candidates could have dominated that swim lane and been competitive with Jeff. That did not happen. In other words, what I'm talking about is the John Schroeders, the Stephen Wagaspaks, the Richard Nelsons. They never were able to make a compelling case for their candidacy that would get them that 20% of the vote that I thought was vital to be a possible runoff contender. And of course, they ended up in single digits. Some of that, in my opinion, too, is misreading the audience, because what you'll notice about what Jeff did, There's really two parts, in my opinion, to his message. The first was he took the Mike Foster-ish tack of basically doing the humble beginnings and so forth. Just like a generation ago, Mike Foster was driving the sugarcane tractor, and he had the welding mask, and, or as my dad liked to say, he was showing that he was sweating a payroll. But that kind of imagery, whatever one may think of it from a cerebral standpoint, that kind of imagery works from a getting the vote standpoint. And Jeff pretty much deployed a similar tack when he was talking about his humble beginnings and having his wife speak for him and so forth. The other half of what Jeff did, which in my opinion contributed to his win, was what I jokingly referred to as all crime all the time. In other words, crime has become an issue of a pretty substantial amount of concern to voters. He was addressing it while other candidates were worried about outmigration and brain drain, which to me might have perhaps been a more salient message in 1987 when we had double-digit unemployment. But in a period of relative prosperity, I did not see that as being an emotionally compelling argument like talking about crime was. And so the combination of those two things to me enabled Jeff not only to solidify the Republican base, but get a substantial amount of support from independents. And my calculations show that he got about 10% of the black vote, which, by the way, that percentage was higher if we got into rural parishes. So when you're talking about that broad coalition that was assembled by keeping it simple and talking about crime, that's basically what was done for him to clinch a first primary victory, and nothing the other candidates did, to me, really kind of knocked him off that pedestal. So that's really how I looked at the gubernatorial race, was just understanding that you have a voter base that you need to assemble, or should I say kind of different voter bases you have to assemble if you want to win. And it seems like Team Landry instinctually understood that in ways that the other candidates didn't. And you'll notice, too, that Jeff did not really spend a lot of time attacking other candidates, while with the other candidates, to me, they vacillated between attacking and attempting to put out a positive message, when my attitude is, well, you should have done the positive message thing in the summer, and if your poll numbers were as bad as they most likely were showing, only then do you attack. But people aren't into supporting a candidate who starts off with attacking as kind of the default MO. So that's what I wanted to kind of illustrate to you, is using these three different themes as kind of the overall kind of impression I had of the Louisiana election cycle, because this to me is a more interesting election cycle than, say, the presidential next year, where the only question there is, does the likely Republican nominee, who at this point I would say the odds-on favorite is Donald Trump, does he get the 58% that he got in 2020, or does he get something closer to 60%? That's really the only kind of, I guess, open issue about Louisiana's presidential election next year. But those three things to me are kind of encapsulate what happened in Louisiana, and they're important for understanding not just the election that we had, but elections going forward, because certainly if you're running a campaign, I think it would be important for you to realize that the percentage of early voters is going to keep rising to 35 to 40 to 45 to 50, and if you start having a majority of the vote being cast before Election Day, that absolutely forces you to recalibrate your campaign strategy. So that's my presentation, and I'd be more than happy to take any questions. Yes.
Can you guys hear me? Hello?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what I'm hearing with the early voting and the mail-in ballots, it seems that campaigning season has been pushed earlier. So would you say that there's a different timeline now when it's essentially too late to get into a race or too late to start your heavy-hitting campaign ads?
So the question is about how the rise of in-person and or mail-in early voting affects campaign strategy. And I would say with an unequivocal yes, it will. Because basically now, and let's take the example of a typical Louisiana statewide election where we'll have our primary approximately mid-October. What that means in plain terms is late September, early October is when the in-person early voting occurs, number one. Number two, the mail-in ballots probably will go out after Labor Day, although curiously in the 2022 elections, the one that John Kennedy won, I was hearing stories about mail-in ballots being sent out in August for a early November primary, which to me, that boggles the mind, thinking of voters making up their minds 2.5 months before Election Day. But getting back to the thrust of your question, it forces you, well, it forces a campaign to think, okay, I have 3 election days. That means I have to do get out the vote activities in those 3 election days. And I really need to do the bulk of my work before those election days. So the only question then becomes, and this is probably a function of available dollars, whether you want to start in August in terms of the thrust of your messaging, or if you want to wait until closer to early voting. But the old model of the last week is, to me, absolutely a pointless excursion, because you're taking a lot of chances assuming that you can even reach that 50 to 60% of the vote and persuade all of them, when in fact, if you start before early voting, to me, that's a twofer you get, because, well, really a threefer technically, because number one, you are ultimately impacting election day voters. Number two, you're hitting the in-person early voters before in-person early voting starts while the message is still fresh. And number three, even though I talk about people voting the mail-in ballots right when they hit the kitchen table, mail comes in pretty steadily throughout the season, and so it's not like everybody's turning in their mail-in ballots from the moment it's dropped. It's more of a case of some people may vote that first week of September, some may vote that third week, some may get an external stimuli saying, oh, in-person early voting has started. I got this mail-in ballot sitting around. I need to vote it. So it does, I think, front-load a campaign more. And the only question then becomes, which to me campaigns could argue about endlessly, is how soon before early voting do I want to do the thrust of my messaging? Because the other part about doing campaign messaging is you can't assume there's an instant stimulus. In other words, you run an ad on day one and day two voters know everything they need to know about you. It's more of a case of you have to do it over time and the message sinks in, which of course takes days and a couple weeks. So it definitely front loads the early voting season, or excuse me, the campaign season, in my opinion, to where you really have to think of the start date as when the mail ballots drop, as opposed to thinking of the pivotal date being election day. Yes.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Shifting gears a little bit, do you feel like a third-party candidate in the federal elections, the national election, is going to be a big game changer this particular election? And I know there have been a couple of people that will do well, possibly, that have been talked about. If you can speak to that for a minute. And then another question along the lines of, again, the federal or the national election, what's your feeling on the abortion issue playing a major part again?
So there's two parts to this question, really interesting question. One is talking about the viability of third-party candidates, and you notice I use the plural. The second is the salience of the abortion issue by 2024. So I'm going to break that question up into two parts. When you're talking about third-party candidates, the fact that we're talking about a plural as opposed to singular, I think immediately causes a problem. Now, given that, if I remember right, about 40,000 votes was what elected Joe Biden by getting, the proper amount of votes in places like Arizona and Georgia and Pennsylvania and so forth, a third-party candidate, assuming he or she gets ballot access in those states, can absolutely change the equation of the results. I mean, we saw that happen. One of the things that was never mentioned in 2016 when Donald Trump breached the blue wall was the inconvenient truth that he won those states with pluralities. So the 4 or 5% that Gary Johnson got, the 1 to 2% that Jill Stein got, that absolutely made a difference in the outcome. I see something like that can happen next year. But the caveat I want to give, though, when you're talking about the viability of third-party candidates, and I'm going to further break that into two parts. Number one, there's a love affair with third-party candidates that, in my opinion, starts in the summer and typically trails off once we get into October. In other words, if you were to go back in time, not only was Ross Perot technically leading in the polls before he got out of the race in July of '92, but Gary Johnson was actually polling at near 10% in the polls in the late summer of 2016. That's the love affair I'm talking about, is the initial poll numbers they got did not equal what they ultimately got. The other thing, too, about when we're talking about third-party candidates is if they're not included in debate, that pretty much means they don't have a very good megaphone to get their message out. Ross Perot had that megaphone. Gary Johnson did not. One candidate got 19%, the other got 3%. So, and then of course the last thing about these third-party candidates is how many of them are going to be able to undertake the Herculean effort of getting on the ballot in 50 states, because fortunately here in Louisiana, we're pretty easy in terms of our ballot requirements. Other states are more complex, where you start to get into number of petition signatures, and you can't sign a petition if you voted in a presidential primary, or you have to have so many petition signatures from X number of congressional districts. In other words, when you start getting into those technical requirements, you can appreciate that that requires a certain amount of legal help as well as a campaign organization merely to get on the ballot. I'm not certain that some of these third-party candidates you're hearing about will have the wherewithal to do that unless you have somebody who can fund these efforts. So that's the way I look at third-party candidates, is they certainly have the potential of disrupting who gets a plurality of the vote in a certain state that is electoral vote heavy. But in terms of that candidate going all the way and getting the 19% of the vote that Ross Perot does, I'm not yet convinced that is the case, because you have to have a compelling personality with a compelling message. Ross Perot, to me, had two messages. Number one, the deficit. Number two, you have to remember at the time you had the House banking scandal, and there was a significant amount of concerns about corruption, and Clinton and Bush were not exciting the voters and so forth. And so against that, Ross Perot and his charts and his talking about the deficit being the crazy ain't in the basement, that kind of provided a refreshing change, but he had to have that debate stage presence, which Gary Johnson didn't. So that's how I look at third-party challenges. Abortion is going to be an interesting one. I'm of the opinion the fulcrum of the abortion, political impact was largely felt in 2022, because people forget that the abortion ruling was basically decentralizing the decision into the 50 states. And so you had some states, like say California or Illinois, where they were not in a million years ever going to enact significant abortion restrictions. Here in Louisiana, we went the other way and did enact substantial abortion restrictions. But given that each state took different tacks, I don't really know if the issue can punch as much as it did in 2022. The other thing, too, to assume abortion would be an issue is, would it be something that either the likely Republican nominee Donald Trump fumbles the issue on, or Joe Biden is able to catch fire with it? Because I don't think the Republicans were prepared in 2022 for abortion. And, you know, to me, kind of the distant early warning, as it were, about about how abortion could have some blowback was the Kansas vote. When you remember that abortion referendum was put on the ballot, that it ended up going overwhelmingly the other way. And I think that was a signal that Republicans needed to recalibrate their message on abortions, which was not done, and it did cost them in several marginal political constituencies. Because one of the things that is not talked about in the 2022 elections, Republicans did turn out, and there was not strong Democratic turnout. However, the part that was not mentioned was that not all Republican voters went to the polls to vote for a Republican candidate. I was in my polling seeing defections in upper middle class neighborhoods of 15 to 20% from Republican candidates. And these are registered Republicans, mind you. And then, of course, the other side of the equation, we're talking about what it takes to win, is independents. Republicans could not close the sale with independents. I want to say it was a CNN exit poll that showed 49 to 47 independents actually supported Democrats for Congress last year. But I also think that that was at the height of the abortion debate. And since then, I don't think Donald Trump has significant enthusiasm for supporting substantial restrictions. So the question then becomes is if Joe Biden could even make a competent line of attack when, Donald Trump shrugs it off. So I'm of the opinion, very long answer to your very good question, is that I think that the epicenter of the abortion debate was probably played out more in 2022. And by the way, you'll notice here in Louisiana this year, despite polling I did that showed that voters were strongly on the exception side. In other words, abortion is a two-dimensional issue. What voters describe themselves in terms of pro-life versus pro-choice is not necessarily what they mean, which is, you have the spectrum of purely pro-life, purely pro-choice, and the broad middle of exceptions. But you'll notice that despite what Louisiana voters were thinking about the exceptions, I cannot think of a single legislative race where A, it was raised, or B, it made a difference. So I see this as an issue that's probably going to cool a little bit next year. Yes. And then, yes.
Just on the Republican side.
Yes.
Do you think that the any significant impact should any major candidate not agree to early on support the eventual nominee, whoever it is?
So the question here, this is good political inside baseball, is the issue of if a Republican candidate would support the eventual Republican nominee, which is one of the criteria that the RNC is using. I see that kind of thing, to be honest with you, as political theater. I mean, you could pretty much bet your bottom dollar that even as much as Chris Christie is, declaring that he's the alternative to Donald Trump, et cetera, I couldn't see him crossing party lines to endorse Biden, because that would be instant death in Republican politics. What I think will happen most likely is, despite the grumbling you would hear about in the spring, I think that the Republicans will ultimately close ranks, because the crucial difference between now and 2020 is they're out of power. And nothing motivates a party more than being out of power and wanting to get back in. So I figure the presidential primary season, I'm probably getting into a topic which probably would be more appropriate in a spring meeting, but I'll go there anyway, is that I see the presidential nomination contest. For Joe Biden, it's going to be pretty much a non-event. The only issue there is how many ballots that a Democratic competitor can make against Joe Biden, because you saw how Florida, they pretty much shut the balloting down in advance. But I would expect a Democratic challenger to Biden probably get 10 to 20% of the vote. In other words, a protest vote, but not a substantial one like, say, a Gene McCarthy or a Teddy Kennedy. But number two, when we're talking about the Republican side of the equation, because you pretty much have a non-Democratic primary contest, that also means that if you are a Democrat or an independent and you're in a state that allows crossover voting, all of a sudden you're going to have much more interest in voting on the Republican side, and I'm thinking New Hampshire here, and other states that allow crossover voting, not named Louisiana. But what I would expect with the Republican contest is, given just the overlarge lead that Donald Trump has, and this is, I'm referring to not just the national poll, but there was an Iowa poll that dropped at 5 a.m. this morning. It basically said something like he was about 50% and Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley were about at 15% apiece. It's very tough for a campaign to sustain itself when you have a margin that wide, not just from a funding standpoint, but people are social animals, and it's very tough to get them to support a candidate who's getting 15% of the vote. So the question then becomes, if not before Iowa, in the immediate aftermath of Iowa, which one drops out? But I would expect probably about a month of serious contest, and probably by Super Tuesday, it'll be over. I mean, maybe we'll have a remnant of a political presidential contest by the time we have the honor of voting in late March, but I'm not expecting it to be an all-out affair, because if you're Ron DeSantis and you're pulling 15% of the vote in state after state, it's extremely tough to continue under those conditions. But I could see Nikki Haley trying to want to go, all the way. But nevertheless, if you're getting 15% of the vote in the primaries, you're only going to get so much media attention after the first or second 15% showing if you're not improving. Kind of like when Marco Rubio falsely thought that he could do his, I think it was called the 3-2-1 strategy back in 2016, and a lot of good that did him. So, like I said, to circle back to your original question, I could see there being noise and consternation about whether to endorse Donald Trump, but I do think that Republican candidates, if not silently, will, join the Trump train, as they said, by the time we get to the later spring. And so you had
John, on the mail-in ballots, first of all, what's the demographic of that now new 10%? And second of all, do you foresee the Secretary of State and the legislature cracking down on the time limit or the time frame in which these should come in, out of concern of ballot fraud when you really have them all over the spectrum right now?
So there's two parts to the questions about mail-in balloting. One is the partisan hue of it. The second will be if there would be efforts to tighten it up. With the partisan hue, it's one of those things where you have to get to the data through circuitous means. But I can tell you from the data, mail-in data I have seen, it does tilt more Democratic as it does in other states. So it's slightly more Democratic than is in-person early voting. Then, of course, Election Day voting is the most Republican. Now, with regards to putting limits on early mail-in balloting, Louisiana has pretty substantial, stringent requirements as it is already. There are states, and California and Washington immediately come to mind, where basically as long as you have the postmark on Election Day, you'll count it. The problem with that approach, in my opinion, is when you're saying as long as it has an Election Day postmark, the question becomes, number one, when do you close the tills and say, okay, we're not accepting any more mail-in ballots? And then number two, if you have a late volume of mail-in ballots like what I see in California, Washington, Arizona, and a few other states, that's why you have the proverbial 5-week election day. Imagine if you had a presidential election which was literally hanging on the outcome of Arizona, and Arizona is not exactly known for fast counting because the late surge of mail-in ballots, and by the way, mail-in ballots require a lot more processing than, say, people who show up to early vote. You're basically dragging out the decision because of that late balloting. But in Louisiana, and I think Florida perhaps is the same way, we require that the ballots be in the hands of the registrar. The general rule is the day before, but if it's overseas and a couple other exceptions, it's election day. So what that means, fortunately for us, is we pretty much know what the election results are by like 10 to 11 o'clock at night, because the mail and the early drops about 8 to 8:30. And by the way, one of the things that we should be thanking our lucky stars for, so Houston had its mayoral runoff this past weekend, and one of the things that just boggled my mind, you know, being used to Louisiana's very competent election administration system, so they dropped the early ballots at 7 o'clock at night, and fortunately in Houston, 2/3 of the vote was cast early. They literally did not have all of the vote in until the next morning. So in other words, for a couple of hours, all they were doing was dropping like 5% of the vote each hour. I mean, talk about a painful waiting. And Houston's a little different in Louisiana in that they have vote centers, so they would kind of consolidate like 10 precincts and say, okay, go vote this vote center. But the point being is that in Louisiana, we have fairly stringent requirements already as to, number one, who can early vote, who can mail-in vote, and number two, when those ballots have to be in the hands of the registrar. So I'm not really sure what else can be done unless, let's say, they wanted to get into restrictions about who could handle it and so forth. But we do have fairly stringent requirements relative to other states.
Could you give us some background on the effectiveness of the PACs in Louisiana on both sides, please, of this past election?
So the question is about the effectiveness of PACs. I think what the big issue with the PACs is basically you have a new actor in the play, which of course are these PACs, also known as political action committees. And these PACs have the ability to spend a lot more money, which means more ads, they can hire people, they can do a lot more work that perhaps can supplant traditional party activities. So I think that's the big difference in the PACs. But the interesting thing is when you start getting into the world of PACs, they're in the position generally of having to attack a candidate as opposed to officially say, you know, singing a candidate's praises. So it's kind of a different flavor now where if you have somebody with the appropriate grievance or wherewithal where they want to contribute to a PAC to go after a certain candidate or to buttress a certain candidate, that introduces a new variable in because basically that's kind of like where the dirty work gets done now. So I would just say that it just means that you have more avenues for spending money. In terms of its effectiveness, I mean, one thing that perhaps could have happened, and I'm getting into perhaps just because the results were so close. So you remember in the Secretary of State's race, the Republican field was very crowded, and there was a lot, the undecideds were very high there because you had multiple Republican candidates and only 2 Democratic candidates. One of the things that caught my attention was Clay Schexnayder and Nancy Landry were out advertising fairly early, but Clay Schexnayder barely missed making the runoff. One thing that could perhaps be said is that when you had those negative ads that were describing him as Shady Schexnayder, if it could have affected 1 to 2% of the vote, which by the way is the amount by which he missed the runoff, you could, in that one instance, say that the PACs made the difference, because in a crowded field like that, anything that could flip 1 or 2% of the vote, you have to think of as a decisive factor.
Thank you. Again, just a reminder, our next press club meeting is not till January 22nd. Happy holidays. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Yeah, that kept you going for another 30 minutes.
Oh, yeah. But yeah, we got some statements about mail-in voting.
So what I was wondering, like you said, the register decides when it goes out. So with it now being 10%, what they may now say.